Today we're going to talk about the First World War and how it is going to aid in the development of what becomes the Arab-Israeli conflict that will be centered to our discussions between now and the IB exams. First and foremost, we want to remember about the First World War, and you guys may or may not remember all this from last year, but the First World War pitted two sides against each other. We called those two sides the Central Powers and the Entente Powers. The Entente was primarily France and Britain and Russia, and the Central Powers were Germany and Austria-Hungary, and then the Ottoman Empire would join with Germany and Austria-Hungary relatively early in the war. World War I was a disaster for the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the Ottoman Empire will literally cease to exist because of the defeat of the Central Powers in World War I. The Ottoman Empire, we talked about the rise of the Ottoman Empire being so dramatic in the 13 and 14 and 1500s because of its location, right? The Ottoman Empire is like centered on the connecting point between three continents, Europe and Asia and Africa. And that location is going to be the same thing that makes it so difficult for the Ottoman Empire in the First World War. They're going to be fighting the British in Egypt. They're going to be fighting the Russians in the Caucasus. And then they're going to be fighting the British in Europe. Do you guys remember something called the Battle of Gallipoli? You might remember that from last year. The Gallipoli campaign was on a peninsula on the European side of Turkey there. So the Ottoman Empire is going to fight in World War I. They're going to lose in World War I. And the story of Britain is going to become hugely important to the story of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, we started the day talking about whether the ends justify the means in any situation, all right? And I want us to think about that in terms of Britain. The end goal that Britain is going for from 1914 to 1918 is what? Winning a war. That is the number one goal that Britain has. They are thinking about some future considerations, but the immediate pressing concerns are probably foremost in their minds. You've got to win the war. If you don't win the war, everything else is moot. It doesn't matter, right? So you've got to win the war first. So then the question is, well, what are you allowed to do, or what should you do, or what is justifiable to do in order to win this war? And this is where we can start to have some debate. Were the means that Britain used, especially against the Ottoman Empire, were the means that Britain used in order to win this war, were they justified? Did they justify the end goal of winning the war? Now, it's really easy to look back and to look through our lenses of 2016 to say, and to look at the turmoil that has resulted from a lot of the decisions made in the First World War by Britain, to look at what happened to the Middle East and say, that wasn't worth it. But as we take ourselves back and as we try to put ourselves in the shoes of Britain in 1915 or 1916, we recognize that their immediate concerns, their pressing concerns of the war against Germany that needed to be won, and that the Ottoman Empire was an ally to Germany, that those, and they have no idea of the next century of things before them. That makes our judgment of them not so much questionable, but we have to acknowledge what they knew at the time and what they didn't know at the time, all right? So the British are in Egypt, all right, in the early war. The British have long been in Egypt because the Suez Canal is in Egypt, and Britain needs a friendly Egypt that is largely being controlled by Great Britain so they can have access to that Suez Canal, free access to that Suez Canal. Now, if we remember our geography of Egypt here, here's mainland Egypt. This is that body of water called the Gulf of Suez. If you find the Gulf of Suez, you can find the Suez Canal. So the Suez Canal is right here. What was this peninsula called? That's the Sinai Peninsula. The British thought in the beginning of the war that the Ottomans would not threaten Egypt, would not threaten the Suez, because the terrain of the Sinai is so harsh. It's desert, rocky terrain. All right? So the British felt secure because of the geographic boundary that the Sinai Peninsula provided. Well, they were wrong. All right? the Ottoman Empire made moves in early January of 1915 to push through the Sinai Peninsula in hopes of sparking an Egyptian uprising against the British. Now, they're not going to get that. They're not going to get that, but it absolutely showed the British that the Sinai, and if the Sinai's in danger, the Sinai's in danger, so what else is in danger? The Suez Canal. And if the British lose the Suez Canal, what does it mean for their war effort? They've got to go all the way around Africa to bring those troops from Australia or New Zealand who are hugely valuable in the war effort, to bring those troops from India, to keep the supplies of raw materials coming from India. You need that Suez Canal open, right? And so if Britain's got to go all the way around Africa to get there, that's going to be hugely time-consuming and could be detrimental to the war effort. So Britain realizes very early on that they've got to rethink their strategy in the Ottoman lands and in Egypt. And they begin to realize that the Sinai Peninsula is not ultimately safe. The Suez Canal was threatened. And so they will develop a new goal. And not just a goal for fighting World War I, but a goal long term. Because if this is going to be hard to secure, if it is that easy for an enemy power to take that Suez Canal, as the Ottoman Empire threatened, Britain maybe needs more territory. So a goal that the British will develop early on in the war against the Ottoman is to, out of this war, with the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, not just beat the Ottoman Empire, but to take away some territory from them, and to gain a strip of land from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. Railroads would then be able to be built across that section of the Middle East, and now the British wouldn't have to solely rely on the Suez Canal, which, who knows, maybe due to popular uprisings in Egypt, they might lose one day. They could also have access to India through the Middle East, through the railroads that can be constructed through the Middle East. So that's what the British are ultimately going to want out of a victory with the Ottoman Empire. To do this, they need friends, because where is the primary fighting for Britain going on in World War I? It's the Western Front. It's up here in Paris, in France and Belgium. All right? Primary fighting for the British is up here. They're also expending huge amounts of soldiers. We talked about that Gallipoli campaign. They're spending huge amounts of soldiers in this region connecting Europe and Asia. There's a couple straits here called the Bosporus and the Dardanelles. You have to control those straits to get to the Black Sea. If you remember anything about World War I, and we already mentioned it today, Russia was an ally to the British and the French in World War I. And if Britain could control those waterways, could take those waterways from the Ottomans, then that would mean they could more easily get supplies into the Russians and help the Russians in their fight against Germany on the Eastern Front. So that's where Britain was putting the majority of their resources. So when they now want to focus on the Middle East, they don't have enough guys to expend on it. So the hope is for Britain to find allies in the Middle East against the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire is governed and ruled by Turks. Even though the Ottoman Empire had previously made rules of equality of all people within the Ottoman Empire, we talked about these Tanzimat reforms, it's still a Turkish-dominated government. And so in 1915, mid-1915 into 1916, a British official named Henry McMahon will open up a series of letters, conversations and letters that go back and forth. And guys, this is one kind of fun thing about studying history of yesteryear, or I guess anything before the last 20, 30 years. All of these communications are done via letters. Some guy writing a letter, sending it, waiting. Now it's being transmitted on telegraph, so it's going quicker than it would have in a century before. But you don't get the immediate feedback, from a face-to-face meeting all the time. Well, Henry McMahon, British official, is going to send a series of letters back and forth with this guy. His name is Hussein ibn Ali. Hussein ibn Ali. I'll write that down for you. Hussein ibn Ali. Hussein ibn Ali is a very important guy within Arabia, within Islam in Arabia. He's the Sharif of Mecca. He's the Sharif of Mecca. He is basically the lead political and religious figure in Mecca for Muslim Arabs in Arabia. This will be important to our story later, but he is a member of a clan called the Banu Hashim clan, which is the same clan that Muhammad himself belonged to. So he's connected to the family line of Muhammad. This guy's got some Islamic street credibility down in Arabia. He's a big deal. And McMahon knows he's a big deal, and that's why he's talking to him. And he says to Hussein ibn Ali, this just means Hussein, son of Ali, he says to Hussein ibn Ali that if you support an Arab uprising against the Ottomans, because the Ottoman Empire had long controlled the Arab lands. If you support an Arab uprising against the Ottoman Empire, we will support your case for having an independent Arab kingdom in Arabia. Hussein ibn Ali says, sounds good. So we work to round up some Arab fighters to join you in fighting against the Ottomans, and you will return the favor by helping us create an Arab kingdom. Score. And you guys, if you did your reading, you started to read about some like geographical boundaries that they were actually talking about. Like we'd get this, but we wouldn't get this. We'd get this, but we wouldn't get this. The British essentially intended in these letters that the Arabs could have everything, except for this stuff going on around Jerusalem and up in Beirut. They would get stuff to the east of those territories. So not everything, but a lot of it, all right? These come out of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence, all right? Then, the British and the French are also working on an agreement. Now, the British and the French are allies in the First World War as well. And they both have their eyes on the prize of the Middle East, the Ottoman lands of the Middle East, once the Ottoman Empire is defeated. And in 1916, Britain and France will agree to a treaty known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Sykes was a British guy. Picot, P-I-C-O-T. You have that T that we don't pronounce, so he's French. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is actually a treaty between Britain and France. And it says after the war, Britain will control these territories of the Ottoman Empire. I meant France. France will control these territories of the Ottoman Empire, while Britain will control these southern territories of the Ottoman Empire. Now we see there's different zones. Some are going to be direct French control. Some will be French influence, direct British control, British influence. Ultimately, as the story is going to play out, it's going to be direct British and direct French control of these areas. This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Now notice what the Sykes-Picot Agreement is creating. If Britain gets this, what have they created for themselves? That band of territory across the Middle East where they can construct a railway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Persian Gulf. And that way, if the Gulf of Suez or the Suez Canal were ever threatened, the British would have another way to get to India. All right? This is the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The third agreement comes in the form of this letter, and it is known as the Balfour Declaration. Alfred Balfour is a foreign minister for Britain, and he's going to write this letter that is sanctioned by the King of England to a Lord Rothschild. Now, I believe I might have mentioned last week, the Rothschild family. This was a wildly wealthy European Jewish family that gained tremendous wealth controlling banking industries in Western Europe. And by the early 20th century, some members of the Rothschilds became financial supporters, backers of the Zionist movement, this movement of Jews to have a homeland in Palestine. So they'd become financially supporting the purchase of Palestinian land that Jews from Eastern Europe or Western Europe could move to, right? Well, Britain is going to issue the Balfour Declaration. I want to read it for you. You guys read it the other day, right? You probably already read it yourselves. But I want to point out a couple important parts of it. The Majesty's government, His Majesty's government, view with favor the establishment in Palestine. So now we're hearing where Britain says it's going to go. The establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. That language is important, and that language is purposely chosen. It's a national home for the Jewish people. Does not call it a nation, does not call it a state. It says it's a national home for the Jewish people. This leaves a lot up for interpretation as to what that really is going to mean going forward. Now, some Jews, some Zionists are going to read that and be like, yeah, this is now Britain, the first major power of the planet, to actually support the idea of a Jewish homeland somewhere on earth. We never had that before, right? But it doesn't say state. It doesn't say state. It doesn't say they're going to work to create an independent Jewish state in Palestine. It does continue to say, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights, political status, and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. The idea is, just because we're doing this, it doesn't mean that the majority of the population of Palestine, which is not Jewish, like 90% of the population of Palestine is not Jewish. Most are Muslims, some are Christians. They shouldn't be disenfranchised. They shouldn't have their civil or religious rights trampled upon just because Britain supports the idea of a national home for Jews in Palestine. And further, this should not give any kind of carte blanche to any other Western European power to kick their Jews out. Like, for example, the Zionist organization was worried that if Britain supported the Balfour Declaration, that would mean Britain would, like, drive all of its own Jews out of England and force them to go live in this national homeland now, which would have made many in England happy because they were anti-Semitic as well. So the Balfour Declaration says it's not about that. It's not about us kicking our Jews out. It's not about us disenfranchising the Palestinians that are already there. We're just putting our weight, putting our support. The king is saying we support the idea of the creation of a national homeland for Jews in Palestine. That's all it says. Now, why would Britain say something like this? There's a lot going on here. This is ultimately issued in November of 1917. All right? But the arrangements for this, the negotiations, the discussions for eventually having this Balfour Declaration started long before. I'm going to talk about this guy. Actually, talk about them both, but this guy on the left here, his name is Chaim Weizmann. It's like C-H-A-I-M. You got to get a little bit of that. Chaim Weizmann. He is the leader of the World Zionist Organization at the time of the war. He also happens to be a skilled chemist who has done a lot of work for the British and their munitions industry, like helping the British develop explosives for the war. Britain wants him, and Britain wants other Jewish intellectuals that could possibly help in the aiding of the Allied victory in the war to support the war effort. All right? So issuing a Balfour Proclamation or Balfour Declaration is an easy price for the British to pay in order to get the support of successful and scientific Jews who might be able to help out the war effort. Also, we've got the story of the United States. Now, we mentioned last week when Jews were being persecuted in Eastern Europe, like in Russia, for example, and many of them started to flee the persecution of Eastern Europe. Where did most of them go? Palestine or the United States? The vast majority of them went to the United States. Most of them headed west. We talked about Feivel Mauskowitz and his family, right? They headed to England and got on a ship and went across the Atlantic and went through Ellis Island. All right? The United States is going to have huge amounts. This is that new immigration of the late 19th century. You guys talked about this last year. Early American immigrants. We had some Germans, but it was primarily people from like Britain and some French people coming over, right? But in the late 19th century, we started to get a lot of Italians coming over and Eastern Europeans, right? And so now we get this huge influx of Jewish Eastern Europeans coming to the United States. And as they've been coming to the United States now for decades, by the time we get to 1914, many have established themselves. Many are now American citizens. They can do what? They can do vote. They can do vote. Who talks like this? They can vote, right? They pay taxes. Some of them are becoming successful and important in American industry and science and education. They can influence politicians. And Britain needed America to get involved in the war. Now, by the time we get to the actual issuing of the Balfour Declaration in November of 1917, the United States had already declared war on Germany. That came around in April of 1917. But we were slow. We were not moving very fast to get our troops over into the fighting. We actually don't put our first troops really on the ground in combat until the spring of 1918. So the hope is American Jews might put pressure on their government, on their representatives, to get America more and more involved, or more involved more quickly than they have been. We've also got an issue in Russia. Russia in 1917 is going through huge turmoil. Now, it's kind of confusing because there's a Russian calendar and there's the Western calendar that we're all more familiar with. So when you're dealing with issues of the Russian Revolution, there's often two sets of dates that we deal with, all right? The Russians, we call it the February Revolution and the October Revolution. But by our calendar, those things happen in March and November. Regardless, the timeline is important when we're talking about the Balfour Declaration. Because by November, by our November of 1917, when the Balfour Declaration is actually being issued, Russia is being controlled by a revolutionary provisional government led by a guy named Alexander Kerensky. There were two Russian revolutions, recall. The first one was in what we call March. The first one was in March of 1917. That ousted the Tsar. And then a provisional government was established, a temporary government, led by a guy named Alexander Kerensky. Alexander Kerensky's temporary government had some Jews within that government. And maybe the British hoped that the issuing of a Balfour Declaration might encourage the Jews of influence in Russia to continue the war effort, to not back out of the war. Because backing out of the war for Russia would have been disastrous. Now, that didn't work out very well, because by the time we get to November of 1917 in Russia, we have that second Russian Revolution, which we call the Bolshevik Revolution. So the whole Russian thing didn't work out very well for the Balfour Declaration. But finally, there's one other aspect to this story which I think need be mentioned. And if I already talked about this, please let me know. There's the religious connotation to this whole story of the Jews returning to their homeland, all right? Their biblical homeland. In the British War Cabinet, you had guys like David Balfour, like even the Prime Minister, a guy named David Lloyd George, who were devout fundamentalist Christians. Their religion was very strong. Within Christianity, now we're talking New Testament, end of the Bible stuff, book of Revelations, right? Like prophecy on what's to come. What do Christians believe is going to signal the second coming of Jesus? Did we already talk about this? Okay. Okay, I might have already mentioned. Yeah, so there's this belief within Christianity that Jesus is going to come to earth a second time, all right? And that will be preceded by a reconstitution of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Now, that Jewish temple, the same one that Solomon built, like almost 3,000 years ago, and that the Assyrians destroyed, and that the Persians allowed the Jews to rebuild, and then the Romans destroyed it, and then in the 7th century when the Muslims conquered Jerusalem and eventually built a couple buildings on top of the same Temple Mount that once housed the Jewish temple, they built the Dome of the Rock and they built a mosque called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Well, some Christians who are thinking a lot about the end of times and waiting for Jesus to return believe that in order for Jesus to return, that temple has to be reconstituted. And the only way to have that temple reconstituted is to have the new establishment of a Jewish state, right? The support of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Because you would need a strong Jewish state to eventually rebuild that temple, especially in the face of what would be many very angry Muslims who had long been worshiping on the Temple Mount, all right? So for the British, in addition to all of these other practical reasons of like winning the war and getting an upper hand on the war, There's also some notion from some politicians in England that supporting the Balfour Declaration is what their interpretation of a Christian God wants them to do. All right? Now, I would believe that war necessities trump all. Okay? Winning the war is the most important aspect. Man, I'm going to have to come up with a new verb in light of our political situation now. But war necessities are bigger than anything else. I would say getting the support of America, getting Russia to remain in the war. That's the biggest reason. All right? But Britain issues the Balfour Declaration is the main point. So 3 promises or agreements. 1 with the Arabs to have an Arab uprising in turn for an Arab kingdom. 1 with the French to divide the territory between Britain and France after the war. 1 with the Jews to create a national homeland for Jews in Palestine. We can see how these 3 happening simultaneously are problematic. Despite this, the Sykes-Picot Agreement as well, that's hush-hush. That's not being advertised. The Arabs don't know about the Sykes-Picot Agreement until it's too late, ultimately. In June of 1916, the Arab revolt begins. I don't have a good picture, so I'm going to throw up a picture of this guy. In June of 1916, the Arab revolt begins. 10,000 Arab fighters, organized largely by the son of this guy. Hussein ibn Ali has a son whose name is Faisal. This is Faisal. He's going to be important to our story. For those of you that are of Chaldean descent, do I have any people of Chaldean descent in this class? Ms. Ibrahim, do you know who the first king of an independent Iraq was? Do you know that? Do you know his name? Have you heard that name? King Faisal. Yeah, he's eventually going to be the king of Iraq. So anyway, that's him. So Faisal is the son of Hussein. So if Hussein is the son of Ali, Hussein ibn Ali, what would his full name be? Faisal ibn Hussein, and then you want to get even longer, Ibn Ali. We can trace it back further generations. So this is Faisal. Faisal is the son of Hussein. He's going to be instrumental in organizing these Arabs. Because what do you think Faisal is thinking? We organize the Arabs, we win this war, and we get an Arab kingdom, and guess what I get to one day be? King. And guess what he gets to one day be? King. But we're not there yet. Faisal is going to get a lot of help. Faisal is going to get a lot of help from this guy. His name is T.E. Lawrence. If you've heard the name Lawrence of Arabia, this is this guy. Lawrence of Arabia is an important figure in British history, and certainly to this story. He got much bigger in the 1960s because what some would argue is one of the best movies ever made, a film called Lawrence of Arabia, depicted his life. He wrote a book about his travels and his experiences, and then he died tragically in a motorcycle accident. So when you have like kind of a weird death like that, you become almost even a larger figure. You loom larger than you ever had before. Lawrence of Arabia, he was a British officer in World War I, and he was sent to the Arab fighters to help organize them. Much like we talked about the United States sending military advisors to South Vietnam to help organize their military in the 50s and early 60s. Lawrence is sent to Arabia to help organize the Arab fighters. And as he does that, he begins to grow a strong affinity for the Arabs. He likes them as people, he likes their culture, and he starts to become an advocate for the Arabs. All right? And so the Arab fighters join the side of the British. 5,000 Jews in Palestine also joined the side of the British in forming Jewish militias against the Ottomans. So Arabs and Jews alike are supporting against the fight of the Ottomans. As the war comes to an end, Faisal is in Damascus, Syria, and he is going to proclaim Damascus, the ancient city of Damascus, as a capital for his Arab state. The Arab state he believes Britain promised him. But what does he not know? Who did Britain promise Damascus to? Yeah, you guys know Syria is one of those countries that speaks French, a lot of French. All right, so Faisal begins to turn Damascus into his capital. In 1919, at the end of World War I, there's a Paris Peace Conference. You guys are familiar with this? Paris Peace Conference. We already talked about a guy like Ho Chi Minh going to the Paris Peace Conference to advocate for Vietnamese nationalism. Well, now here we have a picture of Faisal ibn Hussein going to Paris to advocate for Arabian independence. Now, right behind Faisal here, there's T.E. Lawrence in full support of Faisal's claims, wearing his uniform, but also wearing the traditional headdress of the Arab people. What's that? The Paris Peace Conference. This is where the Treaty of Versailles is going to come out of. But as we've already talked about with the Vietnamese example, are Britain and France too interested in giving up territories in the Paris Peace Conference? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. In the end, the regions of the Middle East that were once controlled by the Ottoman Empire are going to be divided by Britain and France. We're going to call them mandates, and we're going to talk more about the mandate period in a couple days. The idea of calling them mandates, think of them as infantilizing them, making them like they're children. Like, I've got kids. My kids can't survive in the real world because they don't know how to be adults because they're kids. I have to teach them. And if I teach them well, they will grow into good functioning adults, and then we set them free, right? And if we do a good enough job, they never come back home to live in my basement. Here, these are places that hadn't been independent forever, right? Like, the Romans ruled them, right? Then the Byzantine Empire ruled. Then the Ottoman Empire ruled. And now the Ottoman Empire is gone. These people have never had independent states, right? And so now you've got the British and the French saying they're not quite ready for independence. If we let them go off and be independent, they're going to do all kinds of crazy things, and we can't account for that. We need to teach them how to be independent states. We need to work with them to establish democratic institutions and educational institutions and set up business institutions. We need to help them formulate their states. These are known as mandates, all right? They're not colonies. Because after World War, remember the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson said we shouldn't be taking over new territory here. So we're not taking over new territory. These are just mandates. And shockingly, if we look at this map, the mandates that the British are going to get largely parallel, and the mandates that the French are going to get largely parallel what the British and French had already agreed to in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Shocker. And Britain, with their mandate, will be able to build their railroads from the Mediterranean Sea all the way across to the Persian Gulf. And through the wonders of modern technology, I can do this. I laid one map right on top of the other, and you see how closely those parallel to each other. And you can predict the problem that we're going to talk to in a couple days. I'll talk about it in a couple days. If we go back to this map, you can see it more clearly now. The Arabian state that's going to be south here, the Arabs or the British and the French are perfectly cool giving that to the Arabs. It's a desert. We don't know about the oil yet. Oh, we should have thought about that one. But there's a lot of desert down here right now. But these regions, the British and the French are going to move to control, which are virtually identical to the Sykes-Picot Agreement that they laid out. Now, I mentioned already that city of Damascus, right here on this map, that ancient city of Damascus, Faisal had already started setting up shop at the end of the war to make Damascus his capital for an Arab caliphate, or for his Arab kingdom. There's history there. Damascus was like the first capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, going back in the history of Islam. Faisal was going to make that his capital. But who's ultimately going to control that? We've got a problem on our hands, folks, and we will talk about that problem in our next class.